Good evening, all. I find it a special pleasure to be here. I feel like I'm among a few very old friends, long-time friends, we're not old, and many new friends. And I hadn't thought to do this, but I thought that in beginning that I'd like to remember and honor, and if we all had a wine glass to toast with, Abraham Rogratnik, who is Sam and Lynn's friend, who seems to have provoked all this. Bless you, Abraham. I thought I'd like to touch on a subject that is probably a little bit dangerous to try to, that the notion or the idea that we call creativity. It's something that was probably at the root of that film that most of us would remember called Amadeus, which of course is reputed to have been about Mozart's life. And I think out of reflecting on it, I've come to think that it wasn't so much the story of Mozart or his music, but where did it come from? Salieri struggled through the whole of it with that question. And of course, he attributed it to something he called God. And I thought if we're going to get into that, we'll need another few hours, so we won't go there. But it exists in the midst of all we know and all we do. I hadn't realized it, but I thought I might close the circle that Timothy Taylor began by talking about perceptions of his youth. And we've had more than a few comments tonight about this notion of memories. When I was 14 years old, I had the opportunity to go to a place for the summer that was the home of a great uncle that I subsequently learned I was hugely fortunate to have in life. And we called him Monk. And my older brother had been up there before me, and I was to follow. And so I took I think it was the Jarvis Express in those days, and got dumped off at a float in the middle of Billings Bay, which was not connected to the land. And the Jarvis Express then sailed away, and there I was in the Pacific Northwest with very little around besides trees and the ocean. And eventually my older cousin's black dog came putting around the corner, and we traveled back through Jack Jack Cove and then walked overland about half a mile to this most amazing log house that is another story also. And found myself sleeping that night in a wonderfully robust bed made of logs. Got up the next morning and went down, and Uncle already had fresh bread baked. And he said, "Well, young lad, what are you going to do this summer?" And in my 14 years of wisdom said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, why don't we build a boat?" And I said, "Well, I don't know how to build a boat." He says, "Well, of course you don't if you haven't done it before, so let's find out." He says, what do you think the first thing you need?" And I said, "Probably some lumber." And he said, "Well, that's close. That's not bad." He says, "But before that," silence. And he said, "Well, you need an idea. Something we otherwise might call a design. You need a concept, you need a vision. So you go away today and think about your idea, and we'll come back tomorrow and see where that's got." So by the next morning, I had a boat designed. I had wandered around and looked at some of the other examples. Being on an island, that was basic to life. And part of this story is significant because we are on an island. And one of the things about an island, it is complete within itself. And there's a couple of incidents in the story that are born of that. So with the idea in hand, he said, now we should probably get onto that lumber you talked about needing. I said, where do you think we're going to find that? And I said, well, I was wandering around yesterday, I found some stacked up on the wall in the barn that looked like might be good to use. And he said, well, that's a good idea too. He says, we probably can, but that didn't come out of the sky, so let's find out where it came from. So we ended up exploring this wonderful half-mile of beach that he had, and I learned about cedar logs and fir logs and hemlock logs and what the differences were, yellow cedar in particular. And we rolled some into the water and around the point to a sawmill he had there, and dragged them up and cut lumber and ran it through the planer and took that and then stacked it up before we used the lumber that was already there, which replaced what somebody else had created. And through the course of the summer, a boat transpired, and I went home the end of that summer with this craft in tow that I had created, knowing that pride that Stanley tells us dogs don't feel. And it left me reflecting on another way of illustrating perhaps a similar kind of point, because what I do, what we do, and my colleagues, is work with people about ideas that take physical form, and one of the mediums of describing that is drawing. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people say, well, I can't draw, but here's my idea, and they would struggle with a sketch of some sort or another. And I would typically respond by saying, well, that's actually not true. Somehow you've come to think that you can't draw. Somebody convinced you're not drawing correctly, and therefore you're not capable, and which is unfortunate. But somewhere between 5 years and 25 years of age, we go from being able to draw to not being able to draw. And it's always intrigued me that every child can draw. We can all draw as children, and we draw as we see. We draw the way I think medieval man drew before the Renaissance man taught him how it was to be done properly. And just as all of us in our infancy can draw, all of us, I think, are capable of how many other things. The amazing endeavors we've heard about just this evening is probably all that needs to be said on the subject. I thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you tonight.